Jack. I'll try again. Hi, everyone. I am Jack. I am seeing the upcoming Copenhagen Euros, and Gotta, who has just given a fantastic session on sports, is also on the CA team. I'm going to talk about the incredibly juicy, and I'm in no way going to take the reduction in participant attendance personally, topic of the EUDC manual for Copenhagen Euros 2025. What I'm going to do in this session, I'm going to start off with, I guess, some as a disclaimer on the first slide of this, some personal feelings and thoughts about the manual as a concept and as a construct. Those are not necessarily representative of the entire CA team's views. They're just my views. If they happen to be representative of other members of the CA team, that's purely incidental. And then I will work through the changes that we have made, broadly speaking, in order of impact, from the lowest impact changes initially, or what we believe to be the lowest impact changes, up to the highest impact changes. If you have at any point any questions about the changes that we have made, I've spoken about, please do just shout at me. If I'm sharing my screen and chatting through the presentation, I probably won't be able to see hands. I'm more than happy for people to cut across me. That's absolutely grand. At the end of the session, if you just have any general questions, ideally related to the manual, but even if not, and we've got time, feel free to just ask some questions. That's absolutely fine. More than happy to pick up on those as well. So I'm going to start with sort of what I've branded as a personal disclaimer, as a certified old person. I think that debating, for better or for worse, and in some ways for better and in some ways for worse, has become quite rules oriented over the past, definitely the post-COVID. And I think there's an element of this which has been quite useful, but I think people, generally speaking, become quite hung up on often quite minor rule changes and thinking that it massively changes the landscape of debating or is like groundbreaking. And I would really advise anyone listening to this, watching this, to avoid falling into that trap. I think that, broadly speaking, as much as there have been quite a few changes over the past period of time, it's probably unhelpful to get particularly hung up on specific elements of the manual. And I would also think, if you're in a debate, like, presumably everybody at some point has played like Monopoly or Uno or some other form of game with families. And there's always like that one really annoying cousin who's like, actually, the rules say X, Y, and Z. If you don't have that cousin, I've got bad news for you. Like, nobody likes playing the game with that person. And I think that, generally speaking, it's not to their advantage. And I would really strongly advise people to not overly read into a number of things. But I think that's just a personal feeling. The second thing is that over the last probably 2 or 3 years, the debating manual has fractured quite a bit between the Euros manual and the World's manual, particularly around different motions, both in terms of different motion types and for motions, particularly on supports and opposes, what they mean and how they operate within the landscape of debating. And I think it's one of the guiding lights that we have had as a CA team, and that I have had as a CA team, is to rectify a lot of that. I don't believe that that is helpful. I think it's kind of odd that for half of the year we're all focusing on one particular set of rules, and then for a second half of the year we're focusing on a different one. I think actually one of the benefits of being on the European circuit, which only has one mode of debating, which is British parliamentary, primarily, there are others, it is unhelpful for us to also have different rules within different parts of the year. So we have used the Panama World's Manual as our base, from which we have made iterations. And I strongly hope that we don't move to a world down the line back where we have sort of very different manuals between the World's and Euros manual. And I hope that we're able to align those as much as possible moving forwards, and that this has been a good first step in doing so. The last thing that I will say, and this sort of comes a little bit following the first point that I made, whilst the manual is good and the manual is incredibly important in codifying a number of rules, I really very strongly personally believe that there is no replacement for judges using basic common sense in most instances, particularly sensible judges using basic common sense in most instances. And I think that it is not sort of something where judges can completely absolve themselves of any responsibility. Judging is, and judging and debating has always been, a subjective activity, and the rules are there to provide a level of guidance to those judges. But there will always be quite literally judgment calls that judges need to make, and I think that it's important that they continue to do so in a way that is reasonable and sensible. As I say, those are all just my personal views and how I personally see judging. That might be useful. That might be incredibly unhelpful. Don't read into those beyond them being the thoughts of an aging and soon to be long gone from all of your screens and memories a debater, probably for better people to come along and replace me afterwards. But I will now run through the changes that we have made, and as I say, do cut across me if you have any questions on any of those. So we're going to start with what I and the rest of the CA team believe to be the lowest impact changes. I will flag here that lowest impact, and you'll see this when we come to the first one, does not necessarily mean least controversial, but is the one that will have the least material impact on a debate, how it should be adjudicated on, and the result of that debate. So we have defined low impact changes as being that if you are already judging accurately, this probably shouldn't impact the way that you judge. These are often clarifications of commonly accepted approaches, and just making it clear that we're trying to standardize or codify some of those. So the first change that we have made, and we are aware that there has been some recent discourse on this, of which I have some personal sympathies, but that's sort of why I wouldn't necessarily use purely to stifle use this rule purely to stifle other people's competitive abilities, is those around points of information. So the previous EUDC and WDC manual text meant that any POI preference expressed by any speaker could be ignored by teams without any repercussions to those teams, particularly for the purposes of sort of wanting POIs to be conducted in a non-verbal, or I think the phrase we've used in the manual is minimally disruptive way. This required equity teams to make policy that was in direct contravention of the EUDC manual. I think that is, whilst I know recent discourse has flagged that that was a practice that worked and was perfectly fine, I think that is obviously unideal. And we have sort of rectified for that specifically for the method by which people offer POIs. So people can request that people don't stand up, or that they can request that people offer POIs in a non-verbal way. It is still the case, and indeed we have strengthened the prohibitions on that speakers cannot request POIs purely from one team or purely at a certain point within their speech. So that is still not a thing that should be sort of taken account of, and that is not something that we think is reasonable. Anyone can offer, well, I say anyone on the opposing bench, irrespective of whether the opening half team or the closing half team, can still offer POIs when they would like to. But we no longer have this slightly weird situation where if somebody requires non-verbal POIs, for that to be carried out and conducted in that way. We'll come on to, in a minute, the questions that we have received as a CA team on this particular change. But I will just flag that our expectation as a CA team, I think, is not that people will use this just so that their speeches are uninterrupted. For people who want to see how much we really mean that, I have made Jack Palmer a particular wager, which is that for the rounds that I am judging at EUDC, no more than 25% or 2 of 8 speakers in my rooms on average will be asking for non-verbal POI. So if you're worried that this is going to destroy the fabric of debating, then I at least don't think that is the case. Equally, if you would like to see me lose some money, then feel free, if I'm judging you at Euros, to request POIs in that particular way. But that would probably be quite sad, personally. Fab. The next section that we have made a small adjustment to is on motion clarifications. So the previous wording within the manual stated that that participants could request simple definitions of words in the motion from CA teams. In light of, over the past few years, what I can only describe as an astronomical increase in the amount of clarifications that are asked of CA teams. And I think not because CA teams are wording things weirdly, but because I think people are just more comfortable with, and I think that's a good thing, asking motion clarifications. We have added a section here to sort of codify policy that has been in place now for a little while, where CA teams are only able to clarify in either the info slide or the motion, either simple definitions of words or unclear sort of info slide wording and things like that. So we've expanded the clarification section to encompass info slides and clarified where those clarifications are acceptable and less acceptable. We've also given CA teams the ability to put restrictions on when those clarifications are asked for. This has been fairly standard practice for a while. I don't believe this is changing anything significant, but we are just looking to make sure that some of that is clear. I will flag that, particularly if you are somebody who feels the need anytime there is an info slide to ask clarifications around argumentation that is possible or impossible within the debate, that this is something that at Copenhagen we will not be particularly receptive to. We will obviously be taking this clarification policy well within our stride, and I think people should be prepared and ready for that, and that shouldn't come as a surprise to people, given we have made this particular clarification. The third low impact change that we have made is one that fundamentally was already covered, but we have just made an explicit prohibition on the use of AI during preparation time. Obviously, there has always been a prohibition on the use of the internet, and insofar as you need to use the internet to access AI, like, that's fine. We still have that prohibition there, but we just wanted to make that explicit and align the way in which we would deal with the use of AI during preparation time to be in line with other internet use breaches, but this is a very minor clarification. We on this have received some questions around the specific wording of the POI preference amendment. One of those questions has been around what constitutes consistently not following someone's POI stated preference. And then a second is sort of just what should judges do when they see barracking and how they should evaluate that within speeches. I think there are a lot of analogies that judges should be able to draw to other things that judges do when either whether it's POIs are not offered at all, or that pronoun preferences are not accommodated or respected. It's the word that I'm looking for within a debate, where at the end of somebody's speech, they should say, respect the way in which people have asked for pronouns to be offered, or words akin to that would probably be an appropriate way for judges to deal with this in terms of the barracking element. In terms of the how are we evaluating what counts as barracking, we are not going to place a general rule on how many times you can offer a POI verbally, largely because we do not want to create a situation where it is deemed by the CA team acceptable to violate somebody's genuine requirements for non-verbal POIs. I think if we say that you're allowed to do it, say, twice during a speech, then that means that people might deem it acceptable to do so. I think that judges and chair judges who are already granted a good amount of latitude at assessing this should do so reasonably themselves, and make sure that, if somebody thinks, if it's obviously a mistake that somebody has offered a verbal POI when somebody has asked for POI to be offered non-verbally, to treat that appropriately. And similarly, if somebody repeatedly does so, that they maybe would treat that differently. But we're very much leaving that up to the particular chair of a particular round. A few more changes that we have made on the lower impact side. So the first of these is around knifing. So you may remember that, and this is an area where, admittedly, I am much more militant than your average person. If it were completely down to me, I would say that as soon as you provide an explicit response to your opening half, you lose all of the rest of your time within a speech, and you have to sit down immediately. Fortunately for you and for everyone else within debating, I have 6 much more reasonable and sensible people working with me on this fantastic CA team. So we have simply amended the previous text from Glasgow to remain of the stance that this is prohibited. However, they should be dealt with in the same way as general contradictions. That is to say that you fully remove the advantage of any team explicitly responding to their top half or knifing their top half in any way. We have moved that within the manual and the structure of the manual itself. I think we've moved that section to sit alongside the knifing and contradictions section. And we have added some clarifying examples on this. And we did get a question on this that was quite long that I'll come to after this slide. There are 2 other very low impact changes that we have on this slide here. So the first of this, in some circuits, we have had, I guess, a bit of feedback or a bit of a consistent issue where teams in opening government on policy motions might not model the motion in a policy debate. So we have just simply clarified a thing that everybody should already be doing, which is that if an opening government team does not clarify that, it doesn't change the motion type. So nobody can stand up and then say, well, because opening government haven't modelled this, we're assuming this is now an analysis debate and that they're intending to continue on this in a way akin to an analysis debate. Opening opposition still have the ability to counter-model and have similar fiat powers, even if opening government have absolved themselves of their desire to use any of theirs. So that doesn't change the debate type at all. Again, this is not something that is contentious, but this is something that I think a few circuits have recently experienced. And the last thing, and I'm glad that they've joined at least the chat for this, Path was quite adamant that we removed the line within the manual about the average speaker point at Euros being 75. This increasingly has not been true at past editions of EEDC, and it may be true at Copenhagen Euros, but that is not necessarily something that we think is needs to be reflected within the manual. We have kept other guidance on what we might expect a tab to look like in terms of where we would expect the majority of speaker points to be allocated, and that you might expect to see some speaker points in the 80s and 60s, and very, very occasionally for exceptional speaker points in the 90s. But we have removed specifically the line that the average speaker point of the competition should be a 75 to remain factually accurate. As flagged, we did receive a question around the knifing and responses, and this is quite a long question, which I will go through in an element of detail. Just to flag, we are planning on publishing responses to the Q&As. I believe all except one question is covered in this. The one question that is not covered in this presentation was around the formatting of the manual, which we have since changed, if you had issue with the watermark background on it. So the question that we received on this is quite a long one. So how do whips explain the impact of gaps to an opening case? In the status quo, when an opening team misses an essential gap, but the opposing bench is weak and never contends that gap, the clearest extension is often analytical. However, judges often say that they don't understand the impact of the gap without it being explained to them. Usually, the cleanest way to do this is to point out what easy response would have toppled the opening case that closing is no longer vulnerable to. But this is now disallowed. Could you add a clarifying example on what would be acceptable weighing? I will get to the example in just a moment. I do want to be incredibly clear on one thing, which is that it has always, for the extent of time that there has been a manual describing the rules of British parliamentary debating, been prohibited for a closing half team to invent rebuttal to their opening half team. That is the definition of knifing. That is the definition of contradicting, where you are providing argumentation to disprove your own bench. And the thing that this is where I will maybe get a bit more philosophical in British parliamentary debating. This worked much better when the UK had a coalition government, as an example, but now we've formed into majority governments. But if you're trying to get in Parliament, in British Parliament, but in most parliaments, legislation passed, people will have different reasons for supporting or opposing the legislation that is passed, the motion that is being passed through a house. That doesn't mean they disprove people who are functionally arguing for the same side as them. They're just trying to make sure that a majority of people believe them. So if you don't agree with stuff that your top half has said, or you don't think that it's a good argument, it is not a good, it wouldn't be a good, in the context of a parliament, strategy for you to be disproving argumentation for somebody who is bringing you votes. The same is true in British parliamentary debating. The core job of a closing half team is to advance the claims made on their bench, to advance the strength of their bench, whether you're closing government, advancing the strength of the proposition, whether you're closing opposition, advancing the strength of the opposition. That is the core, fundamental, at the heart of the entire game goal. And providing responses that have not been given to your top half, that weakens your top half, is failing, and not just failing, but actively not doing that. So this has never been allowed, and claims that this has been allowed are untrue. It might be that judges have overlooked this. I would argue that is poor judging, but those have never been allowed. In terms of the answer to the question, though, about can we provide a good example as to what would be acceptable weighing, I think in many instances, this is about about whether you highlight a gap in your opening half and say this gap is horrendously big, they haven't proven this, or highlight the contribution that you have made and say this contribution is incredibly important because it unlocks a load of stuff. And you might sit there and think, yes, but Jack, this is the same thing. It's just rephrased. Like, what's the point? Well, the point is that this is a game of persuasion, and you are trying to persuade for your bench that the thing should happen, and persuading that your overall case is stronger because your contribution is important is a much better way of doing that than explaining that your top half was just a bit rubbish and you shouldn't believe anything they say, because that's not helping your bench writ large. So if the motion was something like this, I think the example that we're going to likely use in the published responses, this House believes that the USA should pressure Denmark into giving over Greenland or having a referendum on Greenland or whatever Trump was chatting about a while ago before he got distracted with other things in the world. Opening government might explain that it would be good for Greenland to be part of America because everyone's going to become super rich, right, as a result of that. They're going to get loads of money from America. It's going to be great. Probably the Trump dream. Let's pretend for a minute that opening opposition and closing opposition say literally no words, whether they walk off in like an absolute storm at the idea that this could even be a debate that is mooted, or they just don't have any words to say. And you're in closing government, and you explain why it is that America's pressure on Denmark for them to hand over Greenland to America is going to be successful. You effectively fill what people might call a likelihood burden. The weighing that you should give on this, in my view, and I think the CA team's view, is that you should focus on why it is important to fill that likelihood burden. For example, this is the analysis that ensures that opening government benefits actually materialize and makes it clear exactly how these benefits accrue, to whom they accrue, and in what situations. Obviously, in that, I have not used any proper nouns, and you would presumably want to and explain who those people that these benefits accrue to are, what those situations are, why those are really important. But that is the contribution that you have made, and that is incredibly important for you to make, because you actually demonstrate that you do lead to those things. And in saying that, firstly, you probably persuade the judge that that was a necessary thing that needed to be done along the proposition bench. But secondly, you're actually saying, here's why the stuff we've done is good. And if you think about this from a basic game theory perspective, if you're going to win a debate, do you want to win a debate where you have convinced the judges that the team that you're beating have given a pair of 80s? Or do you want to win a debate by convincing the judges that the team that you have beaten have given a pair of 72s? That's a bit of an exaggeration, but you presumably want them to sound pretty good so that when you beat them, you sound even better than pretty good, not just better than not particularly good. So I think it's really important that you think about things in that way. And that would be an example of how you can pivot that justification without explaining why it is that opening government might be unlikely to be true. It would be unreasonable to say, well, this is not going to be successful. The opening government could, or opening opposition or closing opposition could have said, here are some reasons why it won't be successful, and we overcome that. Because in doing that, you are undermining the case that has already been brought. And that has never been permitted within the rules. If I move on to the next set of low impact changes, I'm not seeing any questions here or anyone cutting across me, so I'm just going to continue. Like I say, if people want to cut across me, please do. We've made a couple of small changes to things that are allowed or prohibited within whip speeches. The first of these is that the previous manual prohibited whip speakers from, and I quote, inserting new arguments based on moral truths. And that's quite a vague statement. So we have just clarified what this means. And the way that we have clarified this is that we have said it is perfectly acceptable for teams who have made argumentation such as, but this will really affect the poorest people in society, to, when weighing that contribution, to say, well, this is really important because we have some duties to these people, and in the weighing have some sort of morality and moral aspects to that. That's totally fine. What we are saying is that that we shouldn't have sort of brand new argumentation that is in and of itself based on moral truth. Like the construction of an argument shouldn't be the moral truth itself, but the weighing that the whip speaker may wish to do, perfectly fine for that to be based on elements of morality. And the second change that we have made, again, this is something that not only have we allowed for, that I think it was allowed for, it's just something that the previous manual was silent on, but we very strongly encourage, like this is a thing that whips should do, not just should be allowed to do, though they previously were, is flipping opposing material and weighing such material against the other teams within the debate. And we think that's a good thing that whips should generally choose and aim to do throughout. Those are the low impact changes. We're going to crank things up a notch and come on to some of the more moderate changes that we're making within the manual. So the way we have defined moderate changes is that if you are already judging accurately, there may be some small impact on the way that you currently judge as the result of these changes. These tend to be some clarifications around some genuine grey areas. The first of these is around points of information. Again, so the previous manual text allowed for judges to reduce speaker points for those speakers who failed to take POIs. I am not sure how many people have ever really done that in practice. The text change that we have made with some reasonable caveats for where there are some, we've all been in debates where you have to do an element of mathematics to have what might be a quite clear but tight result fit. there are some reasonable habits around that, but that generally speaking, judges should reduce the speaker points for speakers that fail to take points of information. Points of information are an important part of the game. They represent an element of engagement between teams, an element of responsiveness. I was going to say the one that ends with activity, but I can't work out what the conjugation of that word would be. But there's an element of responsiveness involved with this, and that's incredibly important for people to be practicing and doing. And as a result, we think that people who fail to do that or who choose to avoid points of information should not receive for the same speech somebody who does do that and gives an identical speech, and that should be reflected in the speaker points they provide. The second thing that we have done is around the ordinary intelligent voter. And we have added here some clarifying examples around how judges, I've used specialized with a Z, I feel unclean. We've added some examples around how judges should assess specialized knowledge. This has always been a bit of a contentious aspect as to how much judges should assess knowledge that is very particular to somebody's degree or somebody's personal experiences or anything else within the context of debating. But we have added new text to make sure that judges are rewarding appropriately well explained knowledge. And that is to say that if people give you compelling reasons and reasons that the OIV can follow to believe technical or specialized claims, that is good. And that if people contest that, that is also good. And that judges should, generally speaking, try and side with whoever has provided the obviously highest quality argumentation, but the one that requires the chair or the panel in general to make the fewest sort of leaps beyond OIV knowledge in order to do so. I think this is generally something that people are doing, but we wanted to add a few examples just to help smooth the gears on that. And then on burdens, we have added a reasonable amount of text on this. So I think burdens are something that get thrown around quite a lot within the debating, and often quite a lot by judges. And I think there's an element here about how insertionary judges tend to be that people should look into and make sure that they're not overly inserting themselves into debating or into debates, maybe into debating as well. But we have tried to clarify as far as is possible that missing burdens within an argument do not mean that the argument itself is null and void. It just mitigates or reduces the argument's impact within the round. Kind of similar, if you think about it, to if somebody makes a perfect argument and a team says, but this might not manifest in all instances, or the impact of this might not be that great, or this might not be electorally determinative if we're talking about a group of people in a democracy debate. You as a judge would probably be like, well, that's quite mitigatory as a response. And similarly, if there's a gap in somebody's burden, in the burdens that somebody is trying to fill, it means it's probably a bit mitigated as an argument. It doesn't mean that the argument is negated, and that judges should work to try and understand actually what does that mean in terms of the argument. And often we end up in debates where we're trying to understand, well, to what extent is the missing burden from argument A more or less important than the missing burden in argument B, and that's totally fine. That's part of judging. That's what you're there for. But that's the way that we should be assessing this, as opposed to saying, well, you haven't proved this is likely, therefore we discredit this argument entirely. And again, I don't think that lots of judges are doing this, but it's something that we just wanted to make sure is explicitly clarified within the text itself. We have then made a few changes to the motions and the motion types. These are the ones that we have branded. There's one that's slightly higher impact that we'll talk about in a moment. But do you want to flag a couple of the moderate impact changes? On this House supports and opposes, this is basically no change from the Glasgow Euros manual. This is a small change or a moderate change from the Panama Worlds manual, because we have adopted the EUDC wording on this House opposes and supports motions. In particular, that the debate occurs in line with the likely manifestation of the phenomenon that you are supporting or opposing. In addition to this, we have clarified something that was ambiguous in previous wording, which is that the debate takes place across the lifespan of the thing that you are supporting or opposing. It is not purely a forward-looking debate, purely a retrospective debate, purely a debate about the present. It is a debate about all the time that that has existed for. If you are saying this house supports the iPhone, that debate starts from the start point of the iPhone to whatever endpoint everyone decides Apple is rubbish and moves back to Android phones like sensible people. On this house predicts X rather than Y, this is a very small change, but we've just added a new variation under this house predicts, in which teams are debating the relatively likelihoods of two different outcomes. It does not have to be the case that both outcomes are really likely, it does not have to be the case that both outcomes are nearly 50% likely, it does not have to be the case that either outcome is even unlikely, or we could be talking about two very likely things, two very unlikely things, two middlingly likely things. You're just questioning whether one of those is more likely than the other. The last thing on these moderate changes is on this house hopes. So in line with the world's manual, we have moved this motion type to being under this house supports and opposes. I will flag here that there may well be stylistic or grammatical or rhetorical reasons for setting motions of this type or of other types. I will go out on a limb here, and again, personal view, not the view of the CA team, necessarily might be. The Zagreb Euros final from 2022 is a very good stylistic choice in terms of how you set a motion around a particular topic. And it might be that that is useful language for CA teams down the future to use. We just don't think they need special rules themselves. They can be covered well under this house supports and opposes rules, and that is the best place for them, as opposed to inventing things that have previously existed, whether that's preconditions, whether that's sort of a future-looking debate. We think that it's important this is done in a sort of similar way to this house supports and opposes, in line with the world's manual. The last moderate impact changes come here in front of you. So the first of those is on how people deal with countries in motions. This house believes that France should do something. This house believes that X is in the interests of Djibouti. So we have added a section in this manual as to how to deal with motions that reference a country. And we strongly are of the belief that judges should take quite a maximalist approach as to how you, or a reasonably maximalist approach as to how you interpret a country. A country is more than just its government. It is also encompasses obviously its people, things that exist within that country. There's some, I think, examples within the manual about what do you do about non-residents who live or work in a country, or sort of diaspora communities who might be heavily tied to that country. We think that all things that can be reasonably about the country itself and the broadest entity of the country are fair game within the debate. Obviously, it is the case that those things do not carry always equal weight, and different groups of people or different aspects of a country that you might wish to talk about may carry different weights and can be weighed differently within a debate, as you would in literally any other debate. That is still the case. But we think that people should take sort of broad approaches along those lines. If CA teams wish to make debates around specifically whether something is in the interest of a government of a country, they should do that in the wording and make it clear that this house believes that it's in the interest of the government of France, Djibouti, other countries. We have also added a sort of acceptance of counter models that are maybe softer counter models where they are mutually exclusive. That is, the opening government cannot stand over that counter model to be acceptable within the debate. The one thing we've also added on this, because again, I think this is in line with the model question on the low impact changes, we have added in here that our expectation in the instance that opening opposition are counterpropping is that they should be as explicit as reasonably possible in doing so. We, again, are not going to set a hard and fast rule as to what reasonably explicit says. They don't have to hold up an amber flag to indicate that this is a counter model or something like that. But we will be reasonably unsympathetic to teams who feel aggrieved in an instance where the judge hasn't worked out that we were counterpropping. Well, if the judge had to work it out, you should be clearer about it. And using the word counterpropping would probably be helpful, but making sure that it is explicit that you are doing that would be a really beneficial thing for people to do. And we think that is a reasonable ask of opening opposition teams when they are counter-modeling. The last thing in terms of moderate impact changes that we also received a few questions of, varying from the reasonable to the less reasonable, and you will see all of them on the next slide. There's only three, is around the speaker scale. So we have provided guidance on the sorts of questions that we would expect judges to be asking when allocating speaker points. The sort of reason we're doing this is it's an attempt to help further standardize the allocation of speaker points across the tournament. We think that different judges, and in particular different chair judges, are sometimes really, really, I guess, stingy or generous in some of the speaker points that they allocate based on how they see a debate. And that is not something that we are going to be able to, that we claim we're going to be able to rectify ourselves. However, we think that providing guidance is probably quite useful in helping standardize how people use the speaker scale during the allocation of speaker points. In addition to this, we have put some work into trying to work out reasonable questions and prompts to ask ourselves as judges. We expect these to be used. And that doesn't mean that we expect these to be used in every situation to their absolute fullest. But there's no point in us putting this work in for people to ignore it. And I'll come on to the wording that we have introduced in a second. But just to share with you some of the questions that we have received on this. The first one, probably the most reasonable. Are chair judges expected to go through all these questions for each speaker? Is this expected to be done word for word? How much time do you expect this to take? The second one, I'll let you judge the reasonableness. Let's do a little math. You have 8 speakers. You have 5 minutes for speaks. That's 300 seconds. You have 37.5 seconds per speaker. How are you supposed to get through mandatory questions for each speakers in 37.5 seconds apiece, not even considering what happens if someone disagrees? And the last question that we got on this is, again, the similar sort of approach. And this is where we have amended the initial wording when we amended the formatting of the manual immediately, that I think it was the morning after we published the manual, which is around what level of following these guidance is expected, because the first paragraph of the manual suggested that we strongly wanted to use these questions, and then the sort of explanation spreadsheet suggested that we wanted this to be used sort of as guidance and a little bit more up to the chair's discretion. We want to be really clear here. This CA team is not so unreasonable as to expect panels to answer 32 different questions during the allocation of speaker points. We expect chairs to reference this guidance as they deem appropriate. The manual already gives chairs who we trust, particularly at this competition, the latitude to conduct discussions in the way that they see fit based on their experience of previous debates, particularly because quite a lot of the chairs, I imagine, at this Euros, particularly knowing the quality of our IA pool, are going to be very, very experienced at conducting very high level, high quality discussions. But in addition to that, we expect them to know when is appropriate to use those questions. And the examples that we have given are things like when somebody is on the edge of a bracket, or when you're trying to assess whether the vague statement within the speaker scale leans towards the higher end or the lower end of the bracket. Might be useful to use one of the questions in that discussion. You don't have to use all of them all of the time. We expect that judges use it some of the time. What we will be assessing for in feedback is that chairs are using it some of the time and or appropriately. We will not be assessing that every one of the 8 speakers has 4 separate discussions amongst the panel that all of these questions are bottomed out on. That was never the intention, and if there was an extent to which the original wording suggested that we would be asking for that, and you believed that this was a CA team that would ask you for that, we do apologise, but that is not the intention of this. It is to provide a level of standardisation and guidance as to at the allocation of speaker points. And in particular, we hope that this will be just a useful set of questions or practice for newer judges and or newer chairs in how to guide discussions around speaker points. When I think back to the first times that I chaired rounds at competitions, long before I had any sort of major judge break, I was just allocating speaks like a lunatic. And I sort of look back at that, I was like, God, I was giving 80s to things that probably didn't deserve much more than a 74. But I thought it was fun. And you sort of feel like, oh, maybe I can allocate stuff to nicely. And I hope that this provides for newer chairs and newer judges just a set of questions that might be quite useful to think about. And frankly, if this adds 30 seconds more to an adjudication, but a load of people who are slightly newer to judging get to think about allocating speaks in that way, I hope that we are all very happy that this has been a successful thing to include. But yeah, we're not expecting everyone to go through absolutely everything. We think that people should use it, but we don't want to make it overly burdensome. And that is the question, the answer to all of those questions. We have then made, I guess, one higher impact change, which is around actor motions. And the reason we have branded this as a higher impact change is that it is technically a new motion type. So there has been, I think, a noticeable increase in the setting of the motion of the type, this house as X regrets Y. Could also be this house as X supports, opposes, prefers, maybe, a thing. These are all not defined currently under the current manual. And I just want to be clear, unlike maybe previous new motion types where everyone's thought, the CA team are expecting to set motions of this. We may not. We're not expecting to set this motion. It is more a case of there have been lots of these motions set and there's no rules around them, which is unhelpful and not something that we want to see necessarily continue ruleless. Although there's a bit of a retro part of me that's like a manual-less world might be a good thing. But who knows? Maybe we go full Hunger Games one competition. So there's a particular question around this house as X regrets and other similar motions as to the extent that the house sort of embodies the actor. And in particular, whether there are any biases or specialized knowledge that the actor might have, and the extent to which that those biases might color the perspective of the actor on things such as determining counterfactuals. And obviously the determination of likely counterfactuals is really important for this house regrets, and to some extent this house supports and opposes motions. So we want to be really clear here. The panel in all debates operates as the ordinary intelligent voter, and as a result should be persuadable to reasonable argumentation. So there are some examples that we have given in the manual. One of those is, I think, is this house as Lewis Hamilton regrets joining Ferrari. We do not think that it would be reasonable for the ordinary intelligent vote or for the panel to try and assume the persona of Lewis Hamilton. Like, frankly, it's difficult enough for people to assume one persona of an ordinary intelligent voter. We don't need to introduce a load of other people into it. But more importantly, the debate shouldn't be, does the actor, in this instance Lewis Hamilton, have an optimism bias that means that they believe the counterfactual is going to be a brilliant, amazing future where they win absolutely everything in Formula One, linking back to Piotr's sports then. Instead, the debate is judged by the ordinary intelligent voter, and they should be persuadable to different counterfactuals that are likely to happen. Those sorts of things, including counterfactuals, future outcomes, and such like, should all be assessed in as factual a manner as possible. Obviously, the overall assessment of the debate is about how the thing that you're regretting, supporting, opposing, doing in this House as X would motion impact upon the beliefs, interests, worldviews of the actor. But we have made it clear that we don't believe that things like optimism bias or like specialized knowledge that isn't specified in info slides are part of this debate. We don't believe the debate should be about, does the actor possess a particularly crucial bit of knowledge or know more things than maybe anyone else should. That should be otherwise specified. We also don't believe that this debate should be about whether the actor themselves has sort of optimism or pessimism bias. And particularly when we are discussing, should we say, more disenfranchised communities, we particularly want to avoid quite frankly icky argumentation about whether or not specialized knowledge or different counterfactuals applies to them. And there are some things that we would quite like to avoid happening there that would be a bit uncomfortable and also just like not very interesting debating. So for things like what I would brand as like the meta of debating that happens from the perspective in particular of the OIV. I hope that that is all pretty clear. The last thing I will just say on this is that we're very aware that this is the first time that these motions have been defined. It may well be that future CA teams say, no, let's go wild. You do embody the actor. That's a much more fun thing to do. If people do, that's totally fine. I think this is just an area where we have to pick a side initially and see how it goes, which is what we've done, and hopefully that is useful. Those are all of the changes that we have made to this year's EUDC manual from the Panama Worlds manual, with the exception of small things like making sure that EUDC is referenced where it should be WDC, getting rid of the tournament structure, and making sure that teams are consisting of 2 speakers rather than 8 speakers, because everyone wants 8-person debates rather than 32-person debates. I don't know if there are any outstanding questions on any of this. I've prattled on and nobody has cut across me. And I don't think I've had my laptop on mute. So if you do have any questions about the manual or about anything else, now would be the time. I get told at work that I don't leave long enough pauses for people to fill it in. Path would like a numeracy lecture from me. I would like to know who asked the question with a numeracy lecture within it, because I'm sure they would be better. But I can officially say that 5 minutes divided by 8 is 37.5 seconds. Stanley loves an awkward silence. I love a Stanley. Cool. Okay. Right. I'm going to say nobody has any questions. Everyone's completely okay with the manual. And we are manual down. Good job. Well done, everybody. Thanks.